Okay, so hello again, everyone. Hope you all had a good break. This is where the fun begins. By fun, of course, I mean never-ending grind that will reduce you into complete heaps of exhaustion by sort of April, May time. But that's how it goes. So if you can remember back, which seems like thousands of years ago now, to term one, the last couple of lectures we were talking in various different ways about the relationship between religion and the state. So we're looking, for example, at the relationship between religion and secularism, so different types of secular states and how they work. And then we were talking about the idea of the state and how this connected to ideas of nationalism and populism and political myths and all of that kind of stuff. And the purpose of this lecture is to sort of just move on a little bit from this and look at some of the links between religion and another one of the core features of the modern world, which is, of course, global capitalism. And the plan for this lecture looks like this. First of all, I'm going to talk about the origins of capitalism and its potential links to religion. This is the idea of a Protestant work ethic, which some of you may have run into before, so I'm going to be giving you a brief overview of that. Then I'm going to be looking at the evidence for and against this theory. And then thirdly, I'm going to be talking about the ideas that there could be potentially a link between religion and economic growth, which has been subject to numerous studies. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about some of the links between religion and contemporary capitalism, looking at things like New Age spirituality, for example. And there's a thing called the prosperity gospel, which we're also going to be looking at there as well. So this is essentially the lay of the land. And first up, we are going over the links between religion and the emergence of capitalism itself. And the reason for doing this, as I've just sort of intimated a moment ago, is that there's a very famous theory by a sociologist called Max Weber, which was called the Protestant work ethic. And this was the idea that there was something about Protestantism that gave rise to capitalism in various different ways. It's not exactly like that, there's a few nuances to it, but that's the sort of broad brushstrokes of the theory. And what Weber was trying to explain is, why is it that capitalism emerged when it did and where it did? Why did it happen to get going in Western Europe rather than, say, India or China, which in many ways had lots of certain advantages that Europe didn't have, right? And there's no particular reason why it didn't happen there and why it happened over here. That was the sort of puzzle he was sort of trying to figure out, right? And so he's kind of going through this process of thinking, why did this world-changing, epoch-making social phenomena happen in the way and in the location that it did? And essentially, his argument was that Protestantism, which, as we know from the historical term one, emerged during the Reformation, during the 16th century, had certain unique features to it, and these features were sort of the handmaiden of capitalist development. And it's important to note, by the way, just at this point, that Weber did not say, I'm not going to run through this whole quote, by the way, so I'm just going to leave it there so you can sort of digest it for yourself, but it's important to note that he's not saying that that Protestantism was the only thing that gave rise to capitalism. You needed a whole bunch of other factors going on at the same time, but what he is arguing is that without Protestantism, it's sort of difficult to see how those other factors would have coalesced into developing capitalist economics. And so Weber's explanation for this, essentially, which as you can see is set out in his seminal 1905 text, is that Protestants have, in his words, a particular affinity or a special tendency towards capitalist enterprise. And so his argument here then is that, and there's something about Protestants that make them behave in this particular way, and this is different to other religious groupings and other religious denominations. Therefore, the answer to this question must be found in the character of their religious beliefs. There's something about Protestantism in particular that makes Protestants behave in this particular way. this is his starting point. So anyway, what does he get from this? Well, as we know, Christianity is a monotheistic religion, and it's based on a moral high God. And this moral high God creates a theology that has rewards and punishments built into the system, typically, the ideas of heaven and hell, and those kinds of things. Now, at the time when, or just before capitalism was sort of getting going, people in the sort of Middle Ages, so the argument goes, became obsessed with the idea of death. And it's not too hard to see why that would happen, right? I mean, you'd had all kinds of wars and all kinds of, population changes, the Black Death, for example, life was nasty, brutish and short, right? All that kind of stuff. So it's natural, it's not hard to go, yeah, okay, I can understand why people would have a bit of a thing for thinking about death, right? But and this is the sort of the turning point, which goes from merely kind of worrying about death to creating the certain things that Protestantism is said to give you, is an obsession with the idea of, or the question of, how can I be saved? So Christianity has this idea of salvation, right? There are certain things that you have to do in order to be saved. And two of the main ways of doing this are through acts, i.e. the things that you do, whether you're out there in the world doing good deeds, helping people, being a nice person, giving money to charity, all of that kind of stuff, or through faith. Whether you get your salvation through good deeds or by the quality of your belief. And some people thought it was one side and some people thought it was the other side, right? And the faith side would basically say, doesn't really matter what you do. You could be a really nice person, but if you don't actually believe the right stuff, then you're in big trouble, right? So there's this question mark over which way round does this go and how exactly do I, get my salvation? And so the way in which this was answered by Protestants comes in two parts. First of all, Protestantism is highly individualistic. And the core idea here is that individuals were and are responsible for their own salvation. You couldn't outsource it to somebody else, right? You couldn't kind of go, I turn up to church every week and I listen to the sermons and I'm generally a nice person and I kind of pay attention a bit now and again to the teachings and, that's kind of basically it. That's not going to be enough, right? You can't simply go along and say, well, the church told me to believe this stuff, therefore that's what I believe. It's incumbent upon you yourself to work out and to find out what the Bible says. This was the argument, right? You had to read the Bible for yourself and have a direct relationship with God rather than going, the priest told me that this was what the Bible said, so I'm good, right? So the argument, first of all, then, is that Protestantism is extremely individualistic and that people have a personal responsibility for their own salvation. We saw this, by the way, again, if you remember, in term one, that one of the things that really upset people and which led to the Reformation was the Catholic Church selling indulgences, right? These were the certificates that were signed by the Pope that basically said, I hereby give the bearer of the certificate entry into the afterlife and all the good things therefrom, right? And so you could be a horrible person, but extremely, extremely wealthy, and as long as you owned one of these things, then you were okay, right? And so the Protestant view was that this is just ridiculous. Like any self-respecting creator of the universe is not going to be fooled by a bit of paper, right? So you are yourself personally responsible for stuff. That was the first thing. The second thing, which came from a guy called John Calvin, is that your salvation is essentially determined by a form of predestination. And so this was the idea that the fate of a person's eternal soul was already decided before they were born. And so there's practically nothing that you could even do to change the direction of travel, right? You were either doomed and that was it, that was fixed for all eternity, unless God, changed his mind, or, you were one of the saved. And so that pattern was inscribed in the nature of reality before you even arrived on this mortal coil. And so the people who were going to be saved were known as the elect. And there was nothing that you could do either way to change your outcome. So this then gave rise to another sort of obvious question, which is that if we can't change this, situation, then it would be quite nice to know, right, which side I'm on. Am I one of the elect or am I in trouble? Now, I find this personally to be a slightly strange framing of the question. Like, I understand why people would do this, but it kind of seems to me like, imagine, that you had some kind of terrible genetic condition that was going inevitably to show up later on in life. Would you really want to know about it? Like, I guess some people would, right? So they could kind of make preparations and so on. But on the other hand, you'd have that kind of hanging over you, right? Your entire life is going to be under the shadow of this terrible thing that is going to be before you. So part of me thinks that, if there's nothing you can do about it, just party for a bit, right? Like, it's not going to make any difference one way or the other. But anyway, I'm not a medieval person, allegedly, so I don't have these kinds of thoughts rattling around in my brain. And this was how people generally reckoned it at the time, right? Salvation was something that would be quite nice to have. You don't really have any choice about whether or not you're getting it, but it would be quite nice to know if you were, right? So you want to find out which side of the equation you're on. How do you do this? Well, the answer for Protestants came in a thing called the calling. And this was essentially the idea that God had called people to particular paths in life. And if you followed your path in life, if you were one of the saved, God would reward you in that particular journey by bestowing success upon you. And so it's not too hard to see how you get from this maybe to the origins of capitalism, right? Because if you think that your calling in life is commerce or business or finance or some way of making money, right? And then if you start to make money, the logic is I'm therefore one of the saved. God is rewarding me by making me rich, by making me wealthy, and by generating prosperity, right? And because I'm one of the saved, and this is what God wants me to do, I should not then go out and spend all my money on luxuries, and frivolous activities and all the rest of it, right? I should reinvest my money back into my business. I should live a thriftful, life, and I should dedicate myself even more to this calling, because clearly this is what God wants me to do. And hey presto, you have the mixture for capitalist development, right? People start businesses, they become successful, they then think, this is what God wants me to do. They then keep ploughing their money back into their business, all their effort goes into it, and they start to become more successful. And this is where capitalism comes from. This is essentially the argument for the Protestant work ethic and the origins of capitalist economics. Is there then any evidence to suggest that this is true? Well, yes, there is some. There's evidence on either side, right? So it's not my job to necessarily sort of tell you what you should think about this, but here is the for and the against on this particular model. The first piece of evidence for the Protestant work ethic is that Protestant countries, notably, the UK, the Netherlands, and then later, of course, the United States, did seem to be particularly successful at developing capitalist economies. Right? The first major capitalist economies in the world, arguably, were Protestant countries, right? So that sort of seems to fit. And even now, Protestant countries seem to place a greater emphasis and a greater value on individualism compared to many other countries. And so this then sort of supports the view, perhaps, that there is a particular Protestant culture at work. And here's some data to sort of back this up, right? This is the latest data from an organisation called Hofstede Insights, which is an organisation based after an influential Dutch social psychologist. And these figures, you can follow the link through yourself on the slide and get all the data. I think the latest figures are from 2023. And this is what they show. As you can see, here's a bunch of Protestant countries. And this is how they rate for individualism. Netherlands comes top with 100. Then we kind of go down, Norway, 81, UK, 76, and so on. Still pretty good scores, right? And here's what you get when you compare them to non-Protestant countries. So we have Israel 56, Brazil 36, India 24, Pakistan 5. Now it's true, and if you look at the data yourself, you will find non-Protestant countries that do score quite highly. I didn't put them on here because it would spoil my narrative, but for example, Austria gets 77, France gets 74, Hungary gets 71. So there are some countries, if you were to do like a league table, it would be a little bit patchy. But generally speaking, Protestant countries come out better on this equation, right? Not always, but generally speaking, they do. And so the general point here then is there seems to be a correlation between support for individualism and Protestantism, and this supports the idea that there is some kind of Protestant culture at work in these countries. And if I was a lawyer being paid to make the case for the Protestant work ethic, this would be one of the key things that I'll be making my case for. So that's evidence number one. Evidence number two is there are also studies which show that there is a specific Protestant attitude to work. According to research, this is the one by Horn and Maisland here, Protestants tend to suffer more psychological distress than members of other and no religions when they are unemployed. They seem to have this Protestant idea that they should be working, and when they're not working, they find it quite traumatic, which again supports the idea that there's a particular Protestant work ethic involved here. And thirdly, we have, the idea of a Protestant work ethic also feeds into debates that Protestantism is more compatible with free market economics than other religions. And the argument for this is that because Protestantism is individualistic, this makes it inherently schismatic, right? Protestant religious groups are famous for falling out with each other over minute details and setting up new churches and new organisations until they fall out with each other and they go and set up another one. There are literally thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of Protestant churches in the world, much more so than any other religion, right? Because they have these schismatic tendencies, because they emphasise the individual nature of interpreting religious texts, right? So because you have individualism, you tend to get more schismatic religious groupings. Because you get more schismatic religious groupings, this makes Protestantism generally, hard to believe I'm about to say these words, and it may not necessarily be the case, certainly as it was a few years ago, but Protestants tend to be more supportive of secularism. Yes, I know what you're all thinking and all of that, right, in big flashing lights. Of course, the United States is now, as it's circling the drain of history, might be rewriting the books on this, but anyway, this is the theory, right? So Protestants tended to be more supportive of secularism because this was the best way to secure religious liberty. And this led to a commitment to tolerance and freedom, which was then said to be linked to greater, wider social, cultural, and importantly, economic freedoms. So if you're a Protestant, you're highly individualistic, you therefore tended to favour secularism, you tended therefore to have greater tolerance and respect for religious beliefs. You wanted more freedom. Because you wanted more freedom, this had a spillover effect into economic freedom. And guess what? Economic freedom spills over into free market capitalism. So this is essentially the train of thought that gets you to this particular place, right? Other religions like Catholicism tends to be much more hierarchical. Islam, the same, don't have the same kind of links. Now, whether or not this is true, I'm going to come on to in just a few minutes, but this is the claim, right? That there is a link between Protestantism and free market capitalism. So this then also supports the idea of a Protestant work ethic. Okay, so these are some of the main arguments in favour, but of course this theory also has several problems with it. One criticism, which was made by this guy, Richard Tawney, this is quite a particularly bad criticism. I don't mean bad as in like it's a terribly formulated criticism, it's just a bad one for the model, because what Tawney points out is capitalism actually began before the Protestant Reformation. Right, you can look at, it depends how you define capitalism and all that kind of stuff, right? But if you look at, for example, the Italian city-states, right, the merchant states like Venice and Florence, which had extremely sophisticated for the time financial systems, set up banking systems, right? Parts of Germany, similar. This creates a bit of a problem for the idea that Protestantism caused capitalism if capitalism was already developing before Protestantism came along. Protestantism may have had a role in how it turned out in practice, but it certainly wasn't the causal factor. It seems to be a fairly big hole below the waterline already. A second problem, which was highlighted by Jacob Viner, is that there were a number of cases where Protestant countries were not particularly wealthy. And you might kind of expect that if you're developing capitalism, certainly at that particular point, you don't have many other countries to compete with because you don't have a global economy yet, then you're going to start to develop free market capitalism. All the wealth is going to start flowing into your coffers. This is not the case. Scotland, for example, was extremely poor until we get to about the middle of the 18th century. So there's no necessary link between Protestantism and prosperity. A third problem, it comes from scholars like Michael Novak and Rodney Stark. We've already run into him earlier on, by the way. He's one of the rational choice theorists, as you'll recall, is that the roots of capitalism did come from religion, but not from Protestantism. They argue that the roots of capitalism came from Catholicism. And their argument is that Catholicism, because it was a European-wide institutional structure, this created something, and I don't want to overplay the analogy here, but we think of the European single market, right? And one of the big arguments in favour of the EU and the single market is that it's really good for trade, because you can be a manufacturer in Belgium and you can go to Spain and France and sell your goods, equally, because you've got the same regulatory alignment between all the different states, and you've got the same regulatory framework, and so basically it's going to make selling goods and services a lot easier. The Catholic Church kind of did a similar thing. Right? The Catholic Church was a transnational regulatory agency that helped to uphold the rights of contract and the laws governing trade, and this made it easier for people to sell goods across Europe because they sort of knew there was a greater level of trust in the institutions that governed economic regulation. And so they argue then that the Catholic Church was actually the motor for capitalist development, not Protestantism. A related point here, criticism 4, is that there doesn't seem to be, going back to the figures I sort of showed you earlier on, right, about support for individualism, there doesn't seem to be anything particularly unique about Protestantism in support for individual effort. So these figures that I'm showing you here, this comes from the same data set, are now ranking countries not according to the value they place on individualism, but in terms of their motivation for achievement and success. And the Protestant countries are the ones in black, and the non-Protestant countries are the ones in red. And as you can see, when you put the league table together, there's no particular connection at all between Protestantism and the values, being motivated to achieve things, right? China comes third, joint top, actually, I misread it, 66. Not a Protestant country, extremely highly motivated people to achieve things. Doesn't seem to be a particularly Protestant characteristic, which again is a problem for the idea that Protestant culture, was the thing that sort of helped to get capitalism going. Now you could say at this point, and I think this would be a fair point, right? You could say, well, this is measuring the situation now. When we talk about the origins of capitalism, we're talking about how it was, in the 16th century. Maybe there was a particular Protestant culture then that was much better at these things than other religions. But since then, for various reasons, things have kind of evened themselves out, right? Now, that's a problem because, it could be true, but we can't go back and measure it, right? All we have are the sort of stats that we have now. But there is another criticism, a counter-criticism to that, which is essentially other factors played a key role in the emergence of capitalism rather than just Protestantism. And I'm not going to go through the whole list of other factors because, there are quite a few and it depends on your political perspective. But this is a really, really interesting paper from Becker and Vosman because they do argue that Protestantism was key for this. But what they claim is that it wasn't key because it inspired people to become motivated to achieve things and to run businesses and make money and all of the kinds of things that the Protestant work ethic theory claims. They argue that the link between Protestantism and capitalism is because so if you were a Protestant, as we've already kind of said, right, you wanted to have an individual connection to God, you wanted to read the Bible for yourself because that was how the whole thing worked, right? Okay, so now what does that do? Well, it encourages people to read and it encourages education. So Protestants would then set up schools and teach people literacy, right? Because it's very, very important that you can read this book for yourself. And so what you have then is in Protestant areas, and they, even in this book, by the way, this article, sorry, they go down into Protestant regions where there were a Protestant church, and then you kind of span out, right, in a geographical, concentric, measuring the power waves, if you like. What you find is higher literacy rates concentrated in Protestant areas. And so higher literacy rates then have a spillover effect in terms of social capital, all that stuff we talked about in term 1, giving people greater social skills, greater civic skills, all of the kinds of stuff that again feed through into economic development. So they argue that, yeah, Protestantism had a big role to play here, but not in the way that Weber imagined. So, faced with problems like this, then, it would seem that the Protestant work ethic theory doesn't necessarily work. So, is there a link between Protestantism, religion, and the origins of capitalism? Don't know. It's a bit sketchy, right? But is there a link between religion and economic growth? Also, no. The answer to this question is there doesn't appear to be any necessary correlation between these either. Some studies, I'm just going to quickly rattle through the arguments on either side of this. Some studies have found a positive link between religion and economic growth. This is one, as you can see for yourself, that found that religious beliefs were associated with good economic attitudes. Right, there was a direct correlation here between religion and economic growth. To get slightly more nuanced, this is a study by Barrow and McCleary, which argued that yes, there might be a link between religion and economic growth, but actually the key thing were the different dimensions of religiosity. And this was really interesting because what they found here was that increased religious beliefs, and in particular, by the way, moral beliefs. So if you believed in things like heaven and hell, right? So if you had moral religious beliefs, that was directly related to economic growth, but attendance was associated with negative economic growth, which is sort of really weird, right? Why would believing in religion cause economic development, but actually religious attendance be negatively correlated to it? And their kind of explanation for this, although, again, it's one of those things we don't really know, this was a sort of just a hypothesis, is that higher levels of attendance were more closely related countries around the world to countries that had a state religion. And countries that had a state religion would probably have more regulations than societies that didn't. And societies that had more regulations would therefore be less likely to be free market capitalist economies and would therefore be more likely to have lower economic growth. And this was the sort of, I don't know, there's a few steps in that chain of argument, but this was the hypothesis. But anyway, they found a sort of strange relationship. Others have argued that religion can impede economic growth. One example here, by the way, there are others, of course, by Quran. He was analysing the origins of capitalism and why it didn't develop in the Muslim world. And one of the arguments here is that it was due to Islamic teachings around inheritance and also weak property rights, which then impeded the ability of Islamic societies to develop in the kind of way that you would need to get free market economics up and running. And a bunch of other studies, just to sort of finish off this little foray, have argued that there's no real evidence either way. So a study by Durlaf, for example, as you can see here, looked at a whole bunch of studies into religion and economic growth and found that there was no compelling evidence that religiosity was important to economic growth. No compelling evidence that religion has any particular effect. Which is interesting, right? Now, you might be thinking, why the hell would you just told us this, right? Is there a link between religion and economic growth? Well, we don't really know, but some studies say yes. And so, okay, this is the most boring thing I've heard all day, Steve. What was the point of that little section? Well, this is interesting because some people do claim that there is a link between religion and economic growth. So, for example, there are religions that will claim that I'm trying to think how to word it, that their kind of cosmological or theological worldview is innately built in to free market economics. And I'm thinking here, and as I mentioned this at the top of the lecture, the prosperity gospel, right? The prosperity gospel, which is extremely popular in certain quarters in the United States, extremely popular in Pentecostal strands of thought in parts of Africa, Asia and Latin America, which is a hyper-individualized form of religion, which argues that you don't need to wait until the afterlife to get your rewards for being a good believer and a good religious person. You can get your rewards now in this life in terms of wealth and prosperity and happiness if you just believe in the right way. So the power of faith can make you wealthy. The power of faith can make you, give you extreme levels of personal well-being and all the rest of it. And all you have to do is follow the teachings of the particular religion and give a lot of money to the church. That seems to be quite a key part of this process, which makes me very sort of skeptical about it. But this is basically the idea, right? It's kind of the American dream. If you believe hard enough, you can have everything you want. Of course, they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it, but this is the argument. And so some people have become extremely wealthy out of this particular religious teaching. Some of you, I'm sure, will have seen this guy, right? Kenneth Copeland. If you haven't seen this guy, it is worth... I take no responsibility for any bad dreams you might have after watching videos of Kenneth Copeland on YouTube, but I do recommend that you go and watch some of his stuff, just so you know what I'm talking about, right? He's a prosperity gospel preacher, and he's become extremely wealthy out of persuading people to give him money, because he's doing the Lord's work, and so by giving him money, you're indirectly giving money to the Lord. And by the way, yes, the Lord does need a new private jet, because this is helping Kenneth to go and spread the gospel of the Lord in other countries, right? So, extremely wealthy individual. But I single him out. He does get singled out, it's not just me, as being a kind of the par excellence example of why this is such a strange phenomenon. Because you'll know what I mean when you see him. Like, if the devil ever came back, that's the guy, right? And as soon as you see him in the videos, you'll know exactly what I mean. And it's really strange. You kind of look at it and go, how do people... I get how people can believe things. I don't get how they can believe this particular... what this guy is selling, right? It's just... No. So anyway, go and have a look at him and you'll and come back and tell me if I'm wrong. Let's just do it like that. So some people have become extremely wealthy out of the prosperity gospel. And belief in this is very common, as I said, in various parts of the world. Here are some statistics, again, to make the point, right? These are figures from Pew. These were the latest figures that I could find. So they are a couple of decades out of date now. But if you find more up-to-date ones, please ping them over to me. I'll be more than grateful. But these were the latest ones that I could find. And as you can see, looking at the figures, they've got two bars here, right? One is for prosperity, one is for health. These are the proportions of Christians in each of these countries who believe that God will grant their believers prosperity and health, right? Pentecostals in the United States, 66% believe that God is going to provide them with wealth. If we go down the list, it's 71% in Guatemala, 83% in Kenya, 96% in Nigeria. And it's similar figures for the health benefits as well, right? 56% in the United States, 74% in Brazil, 90% in Kenya, again, 97% in Nigeria. These beliefs are really popular, right, in various parts of the world. A more recent study, this is skipping over to the United States. This is figures from Lifeway, which is a Christian publishing company, found that 52% of churches in the United States were teaching people that God would bless them if they gave money to the church. Right? Make donations to the church and you'll be rewarded with more money than you've donated. Right? And 78% of people, as you can see here, believe that God wants them to prosper financially. There is also, by the way, I'm not going to go down this particular line, but there is a really interesting argument. I don't think I believe it, but it's quite a nice argument to say that these sorts of beliefs played a role in the global financial crisis of 2008. Right, the whole U.S. subprime mortgage thing, right, which triggered the whole, the collapse of the whole house of cards, and the person making this argument was linking this to mortgage foreclosures and bad debts were higher in areas where the prosperity gospel was more prominent in the United States than areas without, right? And so you could therefore make this link that people were taking on these bad debts, believing that they were going to get rich because they had these particular beliefs, and this then, helped to undermine. I mean, the financial system was already corrupt and rotten anyway, right? It didn't take much to knock it over, but that was the straw that broke the camel's back. So, you can make those sorts of arguments too, which I find are quite interesting. But also interestingly is that this prosperity gospel is not just the preserve of the wealthy. I mean, I see how it appeals to the wealthy, right? Because obviously, if you're very rich, you might, in the dark tea time of the soul, as Douglas Adams put it, at sort of 4 o'clock in the morning, have a faint pang of guilt about your extreme, hoarding wealth like a dragon, while huge swathes of humanity are sort of drowning in inequality. Then you might kind of pique your guilt at that particular point. So it'd be quite nice to have an ideological structure that said you deserve all of this. All of this is because of your skills, your attributes, your personal qualities. You're fabulous. God wants you to have it. Don't worry about anything else, right? So that would be. I can see how extremely wealthy individuals would be drawn to this. But it also attracts people in extreme poverty, and of course this is quite heinous because it creates a sort of a self-reinforcing dynamic. So people in poverty turn to the prosperity gospel because they believe this is a way out of their particular situation. Because people turn to the prosperity gospel, this helps to legitimize neoliberal, hyper-individual economic ideas. Everything we know about hyper-individual economic ideas says that they generate higher levels of social inequality and do not, in fact, alleviate poverty. I mean, you can make arguments about absolute poverty and all the rest of it, which I think, there's a slightly different thing there. But they create social inequality, which then further drives people to the prosperity gospel, and it becomes this sort of self-reinforcing, vicious cycle. As Uka puts it, I recommend this to you. This whole book, by the way, Religious Activism and the Global Economy, if you're doing anything on religion and capitalism, is very, very good. As he kind of puts it, right, this type of religion puts all of the emphasis on the individual, and it basically ignores the underlying structural causes of poverty, does not challenge the structural pillars of capitalist economics that cause a lot of these problems in the first place. And another good example of this way in which religion can reinforce neoliberal capitalist ideas comes from New Age spirituality. And now, okay, we have to sort of back up slightly on this because there is no consensus on what New Age spirituality actually is, right? If you were to sort of try to define it, you'd get different people will define it in various different ways, and there's no kind of set thing you can point towards and say, that's what it is. But at its core, New Age spirituality is also an extremely individualistic form of religion, and a highly modernized, or maybe even postmodern, due to the emphasis on the individual form of religious ideas. And so one of the things that's unique, I think, to New Age spirituality is it puts the emphasis on the individual, and a lot of it is around ideas of self-improvement, which are not always, by the way, coherent. So you have one strand of New Age spirituality, which is all about being your authentic self, right, and kind of actualizing the self and becoming, the best version of you that you can be. And then another strand of New Age spirituality is all about transforming the self and becoming something else, right? So alleviating your anxiety and leaving the stressed version of you behind, and then going through some kind of spiritual rebirth process, right? So those two things don't necessarily fit very well together, I think, but nevertheless, the emphasis is on the individual and how they can improve their situation. And so many scholars have argued that these sorts of beliefs also reinforce and support neoliberal economic ideas. And one way they do this is by elevating the sort of consumerist ideal of religion, so it becomes a sort of McDonald's type religion, right? It's a religion, or maybe an IKEA religion would be better, because basically you can pick a mix, and you get the flat pack bits, and you make your own religion, right? And nobody can tell you that what you're doing is wrong. You can take bits of the Kabbalah, bits of yoga, right, bits of meditation practices, and you can just kind of synthesize them together and create your own particular worldview, right? And that's basically what it is, right? It's a very, very eclectic way of approaching religious ideas. This individual form of religion, by the way, is also devoid of any sort of wider community involvement. So it lacks, when you compare New Age spirituality to, let's say, conventional religions, right? You go to the church, you go to the mosque, the Gurdwara, whatever it is, you're taking part in a religious community. You therefore have obligations to a group of people that you belong to, right? And there are rules and regulations and so forth that you're supposed to follow. New Age spirituality doesn't have that. It's devoid of these wider social obligations and duties that other religions have. So everything about it is geared towards the individual. And that then obviously feeds into neoliberalism, right? Which again puts the emphasis on the individual. So that's a very close match there. But also, this is the sort of dark side of this, I suppose, is that it puts the responsibility for dealing with, for failure, or for dealing with things like stress or anxiety or depression on the individual themselves, right? So if you're poor, if you're having a hard time, if you're stressed trying to find a job, you can't get one, you hate your job, it's all those kinds of things, that's your fault, right? You need to just be more mindful, right? Or practice these particular things in order to deal with that particular situation, right? All of the responsibility is on the individual. None of the responsibility, again, this is echoing the point about the prosperity gospel, is on the structures of capitalism and the social structures that support it themselves. It's all focused on the individual. And this is particularly evident in the case of mindfulness, when we see this being promoted by corporations, right, for making people more productive and more efficient and dealing with stress. And you will see quite a lot of this cropping up around about April time, when the essay season kicks in and the exam season kicks in and lots of students get very, very stressed, and wellbeing services at the university start putting out meditation classes to help people deal with these things. Now, of course, I'm not saying that that's not useful, right? I'm not kind of making fun of it, but I am kind of highlighting the corporate element to this. We're not going to talk about the reasons people are stressed and worried and anxious. We're just going to help them deal with the symptoms, right? We're not going to touch the causes. And that is one of the arguments against New Age spirituality, that it's basically a completely co-opted by neoliberal economics. On the other hand, there is a line of argument to say New Age spirituality doesn't do those things. It actually resists capitalism, right? And so, actually, no, we'll come on to this in just a second. I got slightly ahead of myself. These are just some figures just to demonstrate that particular point, right? This is the well-being industry around mindfulness and meditation, and you can see how much it's grown. This is a global corporate business now, right? These figures estimate that it's worth around $7.5 billion globally last year, estimated to reach $18 billion by 2032. So it's, getting people to be mindful and meditate and all that kind of stuff is big business, right? Anyway, back to the point that I just previously skipped over to. There are examples of religion resisting these kinds of things, right? And another one here is back to New Age spirituality, because there's an argument to say, well, actually, okay, I get the point that you're kind of saying about, the individual and everything else. But one of the things that New Age spirituality does emphasize is happiness does not come from material things, right? That's, apart from the fact you've got to go and buy the crystals and the yoga mat and the tarot and cards and all the rest of it, which we'll talk more about in seminars next week. But basically, they're not saying, if you want to be happy, you've got to have a BMW, right? And a 1,000-inch flat screen TV and, £1 million in the bank. All of the ideas for New Age spirituality are geared towards happiness coming from within. So in that respect, and I think there's a good point here, it's very anti-materialistic, right? And so if you're being anti-materialistic, how does that connect to neoliberalism? That seems to be the antithesis of neoliberalism. Now, there are some various nuanced arguments around this, which we will get into in the seminars next week, but that's just one of the counter views here, right? New Age spirituality de-emphasizes material consumption as a route to happiness And that's the thing that neoliberalism really wants everyone to believe in. So that's one argument to say that religion can resist capitalist economics. A second argument is that, well, lots of religions opt out of capitalism, or in this case, never opt in the first place. This is the Amish, who cut themselves off from the outside world, maintain pre-industrial, non-material lifestyles. Other, similar examples would be cults, for example, that cut themselves off. Not every single religion is taking part in capitalist life. There are lots of examples of those that don't. Another example here are where religious ideas can provide alternative political and economic models to neoliberalism. And a really good example of this is a thing called liberation theology. And liberation theology emerged in Latin America in the 1950s and 1960s. It's still going today, but it's not as strong as it once was, I don't think. And it was essentially a fusion of Catholic and anti-capitalist ideas. So it's sort of like Marx or Lenin and Catholicism fused together, right? And so the argument here was that the church should become more politically... It was a critique of the church, actually. The church in a lot of Latin American countries was supporting authoritarian regimes when they started to crop up, particularly in the 60s and 70s. And so the criticism here was that the church had essentially abandoned its principles. It's supposed to be looking out for the marginalised and the disadvantaged and the weak and the vulnerable and the dispossessed. And it should be doing that. And you can't do that with capitalism, because capitalism creates those particular groups in society. So by being a good Catholic would it inevitably involve you opposing capitalism and adopting some kind of socialist / communist enterprise, right? So liberation theology was fundamentally anti-capitalist and was extremely popular, wanted greater redistribution of wealth and all of that kind of thing. And the final example I'm going to leave you with today is the case of Islamic finance, which is also said to resist the dynamics of capitalism. This emerged in the 1970s. You've done all this, I'm sure, like in the earlier part of your degree. The oil crisis, right, of the 1970s led to oil-producing countries in the Middle East had huge, literally barrel loads of money that they didn't know what to do with, right? And so they then set up ethical, financial and economic systems using this money. And this was essentially, the Islamic finance system. You can get loans to do various different things, but they won't promote things like gambling, right? Or tobacco, for example. They won't charge interest on any loans, right? So that's completely forbidden. Investment and loans are geared towards production, actually making stuff, socially useful things, rather than speculation, right? Which is the typical preserve of, a lot of financial activity. And this is often framed as opposition to the norms that govern the global financial system, because they're taking it's basically capitalism but with an ethical dimension to it. Now, one criticism with this, and we're going to have to call it a day, well, there's two actually. One is that there's no clear, again, consensus on what Islamic finance actually is. There's no single, global or pan-Muslim institutional framework for saying that one country's way of doing things is Islamic and another one isn't, right? And there's a high degree of variation between financial systems in different countries as to what they consider to be Islamic finance. There's no standardised rules for it. But a second more significant issue, well, by the way, if you're interested in this topic, I would direct your attention towards our very own Lena Rethel, who has written quite extensively on this particular topic. And one of her critiques of this idea that Islamic finance represents a fundamental rejection of capitalist economics is that the Islamic finance systems are themselves deeply embedded now within the global financial system. And so to that extent, yes, they might have these ethical dimensions here and there, but they're also, to the greater part, playing a role in reproducing and extending the global financial system, which, if you were to draw a ledger of the kind of positives and the negatives would far outweigh the positives. So these are some of the ways in which Different religions can, in different places, different times, in different ways, support and resist neoliberal economics, and that is where I'm going to leave things for today. In the next class, we're talking about political parties and democracy. That's it, as usual. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you all next time.